Hi, Owen. So it's pleasure to have you and talk about you a little bit more. Obviously, I've known you for a while now, but I thought it'd be good to introduce you to Fighting Fear in our audience. So yeah, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
hmm Yeah, so I guess to start with, my name's Owen. My pronouns are they, them. I identify as a queer cognitive behavioral practitioner, work with a specialism in children and young people and working with families. Um, my kind of role within the therapeutic sphere kind of weaves between youth mentoring and clinical supervision for youth engagement practitioners in cognitive behavioral therapy. And I also spend a lot of my time working with students in higher education and British universities, but also have connections with kind of universities across Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, in helping them develop their student health, wellbeing, and support services. Um, the reason I kind of prioritize and emphasize the queerness in my practice and my work is because I know that there's a deep need for kind of wellbeing and support services for the queer community. And there's lots of questions relating to kind of minority stressors that I see in my work. But also what I'm seeing more and more of in my kind of practice is questions of relationship structures, non-monogamy, polyamory, open book, non-monogamous relationship, closed book, non-monogamous relationships. And I know there's lots of words here, but open book basically means we're communicating openly about who we have intimate encounters with outside of our relationship structures. Closed book, we're not communicating about it. And the joys and struggles that come with both, and the negotiation between freedom and empowerment and security and stability, which is kind of the dance that seems to happen between um, clients who are kind of negotiating their relationship structures. So that's what I'm seeing a lot of at the moment in um, my work with kind of queer clients, but I particularly have also seen a lot of um, anxiety around performance, perfectionism, not being good enough, kind of core beliefs, core wounds that are kind of being played out in um, kind of automatic thinking styles and patterns, and how that connects with the kind of cycle of withdrawing from opportunities that matter to them, and social situations that could feel meaningful for them. And I've been doing quite a bit of work with clients on kind of getting to know their core beliefs, their thinking patterns, their styles, getting to know how the relationship that they relate to what they do, and kind of getting from the outset them to notice and to name the process of rumination, the process of prediction, about things that you haven't got any concrete evidence for, the process of mind reading, the process of going all or nothing, rather than seeing the spectrum and the nuance in between. Um, and I think that's been a great starting point for getting some of my clients to just be a bit more curious before they kind of act on some of these stories that they tell themselves because of what they've heard from others or what they've believed about themselves, because society has also played out those narratives as well. And when you're a minority, it's quite easy to absorb the sense of not being good enough or not feeling like you belong or feeling a bit like an alien. And these there's a lot of work to be done there, in the queer community. So that's why I really emphasize working as a queer practitioner.
Amazing. So just within that, I mean, you mentioned that you're working a lot with universities,
Mhm.
and then you also talked about how you are often discussing relationships, open book and closed book,
Mhm.
monogamous relationships. Do you think, not just from your experience as a practitioner, but also generally as a queer person, as a young person, or person who works with young people, the young people today are more open to relationship diversity or the diverse types of relationships that people can have than
Hmm.
people of my generation. And I guess when I say my generation, millennials and older.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there's kind of this research area is definitely very new, and there's definitely lots of, evidence and research to do into this area about kind of the histories and the trajectories, because obviously we have to remember that a lot of these histories have been hidden, histories of relationship diversity, swinging, kind of and kind of non-monogamous structures have even been, particularly in a queer context, have even been burnt and destroyed or hidden from kind of public histories. But I think there has always been a history of people wanting freedom from the structures of monogamy. There's a long history of that. But in terms of talking about it and it becoming public discourse, I think there is a more willingness now of youth to be more open about taboo topics, whether that's diagnoses or whether it's how you negotiate your relationship structure. Whereas perhaps maybe prior it hadn't been particularly, I guess, commonplace for that to be, discussed at the dinner table or discussed in the pub or the bar. Whereas I think, I hear stuff from my clients like, oh yeah, I went to kind of a polyamorous house party and everyone there was open and chatting about how they navigate their structures. And I was like, oh, that's interesting that it's actually become a community space that you go to. And it's like, oh yeah, we talk openly about it at our bars with our monogamous friends as well. And some monogamous couples do attend those parties just because they're friends with the polyamorous couples. So, but the kind of premise of the party is that it's open and people can move between their partners. And I thought, oh, okay, so maybe these spaces are perhaps being discussed more publicly. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to put my finger on what the evidence suggests about it, but I can definitely tell you what I hear from my clients.
And do you think then amongst queer young people, this is generally more normalized
Mhm.
than amongst non-queer people, non-queer young people?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a history of kind of, um, I guess, open relationships and polyamory, and different subcultures of kind of swinging BDSM being kind of historically sitting with gay men and being kind of even being used in a loaded, stigmatized way in that sense. But now I think the concept of queerness is quite open ended, even as a word, because it allows one to deviate from heteronorms. And one way you might deviate is from the structure of a heteronormative relationship, which typically is monogamous. So queerness as even a concept and a word that is open-ended and is about deviating from societally endorsed norms, kind of lends itself quite well to open relationships and non-monogamous structures.
Interesting you say that because I did a webinar not so long ago on queer history, and one of the things we were talking about, can straight people and cisgender people who are straight be part of the queer community? And it's really going into what you're just saying. It's about kind of deviating from societal norms, which makes you potentially queer. Which is why sometimes often sex workers get included. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
should be included in the queer community, mostly because a lot of sex workers are part of the LGBT community anyway. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but yes, I mean, it really goes on to what you're saying there about, societal norms being channeled and that being queer. And then within that, it's heteronormativity and gender normativity that often are the most identifying ways of going against society, but actually just living according to what's expected from you from society, i.e. being married, going and having
Mm-hmm.
children, and not doing that, not choosing to do that, and making those, very lifestyle choices.
Mm.
Would also be considered queer to
Yeah, the
some.
queer self-acceptance process, which is something I prefer to coming out process as a kind of terminology,
Oh, I love
is yeah,
queer
yeah,
acceptance rather than.
yeah, it involves I was talking to one of my colleagues about this at a conference, was it does involve a process of coming to terms with the possibility that marriage might not be possible or biological children might not be possible. The white picket fence dream and the nuclear family might not be possible. But that has been fed societally into young people from a very early age through like Disney narratives and things of the happily ever afters. And I think some of that process is kind of coming to terms with that you might not have that. Yes, you might have it in different ways, civil partnerships, gay marriage structures, but you go through a kind of sense of mortality about it, is that it is vulnerable. It could be taken away in a way that actually heterosexual people who never question that possibility, it's always kind of set on the trajectory for them, don't necessarily need to. So perhaps, because I guess my point is leading to, because you go through that process of thinking about that not being a possibility and what else might become available as alternative options, you might have already started to consider alternative possibilities of these open-ended relationship structures, these non-monogamous communities, even because we're all looking for belonging. That's a big human drive. And perhaps, okay, if I'm not going to get it through the family and the marriage structure, perhaps these polyamorous communities are the ways that I might derive that sense of belonging.
And I guess it also can go into potentially, I mean, it's a concept that I know that sits really quite closely to my heart, not necessarily polyamorous relationships, but chosen families.
Mm-hmm.
Create
Absolutely.
your own chosen family, and I guess polyamorous relationship could perhaps lead quite easily into
Mm-hmm.
chosen families, and I can see how that would work. Just going completely off topic now, I'm also conscious that you have a specialism in working with neurodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Absolutely.
particularly liked when I first met you, and when we spoke about your specialty, and you talked about utilizing neurodiversity to your benefit rather
Mm-hmm.
than pathologizing it and becoming more neurotypical, uh,
Mm-hmm.
but actually
Absolutely.
celebrating neuroatypicalness, if that's a word.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably
Yeah.
not a word. But yes. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that that's something that I think is becoming more and more the the way to work with neurodiversity rather than trying to make people mainstream, so to speak.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, I've always kind of taken an asset-based approach to my work, starting from your strengths rather than pathologizing. Um, and seeing how you can build on those strengths and what that means on a felt level when you are actually spending more time paying attention and working towards building on your strengths rather than spending a lot of your time trying to correct your weaknesses, how that might feel, for you. Um, and often cases, it's on a qualitative level a lot happier a
Mm,
therapeutic process to go through that, which is, I think, fundamental with young people because this is the start of their therapeutic journey. This should be the entry point. And if you're going reinforcing wounds, reinforcing pathology, it doesn't really sell the product of therapy to a youth culture that is can seek stimulation and distraction in many other ways that's filled them with pleasure. Um, so it has to be palatable, it has to be accessible, it has to meet young people where they're at. And oftentimes these aren't the stories that young neurodivergent people are hearing. They're hearing that they have to leave the classroom because they're too distracting or they're being too disruptive or they're completely out of control or they're rude, when actually a lot of it comes back to kind of strong imagination. People are kind of saying out loud their stories, there's a big creative output, there's a high level of energy that needs regulating. And sometimes neurotypical structures and systems don't give you much space to have high energy unless you're perhaps doing sports or perhaps unless you're in a creative arts space. So a lot of the youth services and youth organizations I've worked on for have been largely sports orientated, creative orientated, with a kind of pastoral mental health and well-being sitting in between those two avenues. But strength-based approaches for me, some of it kind of originates from positive psychology and through that lens. But in terms of the neurodiversity movement, it's actually a political movement. It's moving away from psychiatric approaches to say that actually we can come together as a community to say that actually we are not less than, we are not disabled from being successful. We are just doing things differently to get to that endpoint of success or a positive outcome. Yes, there are challenges and struggles, but yes, there are challenges and struggles in neurotypical existence as well. It's just that that lens is kind of, I guess, the structures of society are set up in a way that favors that way of being, but it doesn't mean that they don't struggle in other contexts where you are asked to do kind of thinking on the spot or lateral thinking, like thinking on your feet, creative output quickly. That is something that I see a lot of my kind of neurodivergent clients thrive in. And I think there's an element of focus that you can do with a strengths-based approach, because there's lots of therapeutic approaches where you're going through histories, you do the history trace, and you're picking things up, and you're maybe touching on a wound, and that can take you in all different directions. But the strengths-based approach gives you quite a streamline for, okay, these are the 3 areas that you can build on. What is it that you can do with your time behaviorally to expand on that, grow that, bring that to the people you love and the people that matter. And the cognitive part, the reflective part, what does this mean for you? The fact that you did an activity that built on one of your strengths. Let's say, for example, I joined a queer football team because I used to love football at school, but then because of my queerness, I didn't carry on with it. But I know that it was really helpful for my high energy levels as a neurodiverse individual. I'm thinking about a client I have. And asking them to journal, write about what does that mean for you? What does this say about you now? Is it like, oh, actually, I can belong in these spaces and I do contribute a lot to a team, and I am a team player, because at school they were told that they were not a team player. They were disruptive to the classroom. So it's countering all these internalized narratives of ADHD as a problem, a challenging behavior, oppositional, defiant, and rather as like actually an incredible active member of a football team now, and that's a whole different strength to follow on from.
I guess this you talked about positive psychology. I mean, I'm not trained in that, but one of the things I'm conscious of is value focused work. I mean, when you talk about what you're saying, to me, that's a value focused CBT or value focused therapy generally. You're identifying values, but you're saying actually those values are strengths, and leaning towards them and finding activities behaviorally that one can engage in. And what does that mean then about you as a person?
Yeah, and kind of how you can reconstruct the narratives. And yeah, strengths and values are they're closely aligned, really, because values are about where you're headed or where you want to head. Like you might value the idea of you might value creativity, but because of, for whatever reason, your strengths have been actually in other areas. So like you might be strong in kind of discipline and fitness and being always doing things according to your fitness regimen, but you really value this idea of being a bit more fluid and creative. So it's at that point, it's like, okay, well, we can focus on your strengths and we can build up that and think about, okay, fitness, how does it work in a creative context? And thinking about how you weave those two together, how you, I guess, steer your strengths in a new direction.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Just within that, then, just another question. I mean, something that I notice in my practice is there is a lot of neurodiversity amongst queer people, specifically queer men. What are your thoughts on that? I often find, like, at least in my practice, almost every queer male person I come across, they have some level of neurodiversity.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's sometimes a running joke among some of my queer communities I'm participating and embedded within, is that so there's a group of people with autism on that side, there's ADHD over here, and there's people with both in the middle, and we're all kind of like navigating our different ways of communicating and being with each other. And someone's asked me this question recently, and I was like, I don't think there's a direct causation between queerness and neurodiversity. However, going back to this process of queer self-acceptance, you start the process of self-awareness and becoming curious about who you are and how you relate and interact with people and your difference, let's say, a lot earlier, because you kind of have to when you kind of awaken to your kind of sense of gender and sexuality. Um, and with that curiosity, that is kind of what is needed to kind of go and seek out those diagnoses. Because I know a lot of people are seeking out diagnosis a bit later now, ADHD and autism diagnosis. I know the adult referral list in the UK is, well, yeah, the avenues are now closing because there's such a high referral rate. But thinking about, yeah, that kind of trajectory towards self-awareness that is needed to start thinking, oh, actually, I might have ADHD or I might have autism. An approach mindset rather than an avoidant mindset seems to lend itself quite well to people who have also been going through the process of queer self-acceptance or negotiating their sexuality. And they can both play out in a parallel way. So I think it correlates. I don't know what like causation is, and I'm not always in the belief that there are fundamental roots that we need to go searching for, but I kind of believe in processes and like, okay, I can see how that process is playing out, and this process would play out in parallel, and it would mirror each other, and people essentially what is needed is curiosity about oneself and who one is, and that really is part of the queer story. And it seems to be part of this neurodiversity movement a lot. It's like we're becoming curious about who we are and becoming curious also about what society can do to accommodate this different way of thinking, being, and relating.
No, completely. I was just noticing that my concentration was coming in and going, mostly because I'm conscious as you move, the camera gets darker and brighter.
Oh, really? That's interesting. I should stop moving. This is
No,
my
but
kind of.
it's a clear example of, you know, of a queer person just noticing that their concentration is being impacted by something happening in an interaction as it's happening.
Mhm.
Right, so that you were talking about self-awareness and being and noticing and being mindful of your experiences
Mhm.
well, just naming them.
Yeah,
uh
no.
um okay, so we've talked about queerness, we've talked about relationships, we've talked about neurodiversity. What do you think the link is in all three in your work? What
My work. The link between all three is an interesting question.
is there a link?
I think there's sometimes a link between relationship structures, queerness, in terms of the self narrative, the stories one tells himself, the guilt that comes up with some of the clients, the secrecy, um, the sense of being an alien in the context of um, being around monogamous people who just don't get it, just don't get this whole open relationship thing. So do you really have a loving relationship if you are participating in it? They're all kind of stigmas, social stigmas and narratives that you have to also face in queerness. So the kind of the framework of minority stressors seems to lend itself quite well to both.
This
Um,
associated to kind of non-monogamous, would you say it's things like non-monogamous people just like to cheat, and they
mhm.
I guess is that what you mean?
Yeah, or just yeah, so kind of just very morally loaded narratives, really, or it's like to treat, or they just they they get bored too easily, which is also a narrative that gets applied to neurodiversity a lot, and like ADHD is they're just so bored too easily, always wanting stimulation, they're always going to be like that. Um, when actually it's love and relationships shouldn't necessarily be following shouldn't be like a schedule, a routine, a regimen, or a complete laid out rule book. It's a bit more like art. It's a bit more of a like writing poetry. It's a more fluid creative process where, and the beauty that it lends itself to these queer relationships and queer people, when I ask them to kind of role model and role play conversations that they might have with their partners, is that they're more willing than some of the monogamous people I work with to have the difficult conversations, because that is part of the constitution of their non-monogamous relationship, is that they have to have the conversation about the boundaries, the limits, where you draw A to B. And I think that is fundamental to a respectful relationship, is the ability to communicate where your headspace is at, what your desires are, and where your desires might not land for the other partner, and where you can compromise and meet in the middle. So I think things about, I guess, using minority stressors to make sense of the why, and then using kind of the lens of frequent points of communication as the lens of the how one moves through that, and where you can touch on the vulnerabilities in a safe way and where you can't, and who you share those with. Because I think one of the key things I found is, so my polyamory is only sex focused. When he's out of town, I'm allowed to have intimate encounters elsewhere. But in terms of the things I share about the voicing the vulnerabilities, that's something I come home to you for, my primary partner for. And there's some real beautiful kind of narrative there that makes it kind of seem like art. And I think the neurotypical way of wanting things to be is very structured, linear, and demarcated with clear defined boundaries, which doesn't, to me, seem as creative or fluid or poetic. So I kind of also try to use creative output and avenues to get clients to think about it through that analogy, and put some of their experiences into art as a way of kind of letting those processes play out in parallel.
And I guess if we think about rounding off our conversation, then what 3 pieces of advice do you think you could give to a queer person who may be neurodiverse and is curious about non-monogamy? Anyone listening, what 3 pieces of advice would you give them?
I think I definitely recommend a book as a starting point. Esther Perel's Mating in Captivity, as a single piece of advice, is a good kind of introduction to the topic. Psychotherapist, relationship psychotherapist who works with couples negotiating these sorts of topics, and brings in the avenue of queer histories to shed light for even heterosexual couples on this avenue. So I recommend that book, but I'd also, beyond the kind of literature angle, I'd ask them to think about what it is that they want to get out of it. So some of those open-ended questions, and kind of start thinking about, what does freedom mean for you, and what does security mean for you? Because this is kind of where this is the negotiation that's very challenging, is in kind of between monogamy and polyamory, is which one do I prioritize? So kind of maybe laying out a mind map of what they mean for you on a values level, and which one seems more important. If not, there might not be one that's more important. And the third piece of advice, I think, if you're curious about it, is the communities and peers that you can find out in your cities. Now, I also appreciate there's lots of rural queers, and there might not be as many spaces or institutions or organizations locally. So online communities as well. I know that social media has many avenues to kind of ask a query or question, but also go and seek out those therapists with lived experience. Go seek out those practitioners who are not only looking at it from a clinical level, specialism level, but who have lived experience of navigating the joys and the struggles of non-monogamy in a society that stigmatizes it.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing. I was just gonna say there's also an app, right? For people who are interested in non-monogamous.
Yeah,
Uh,
is it Field, right?
that's it. I was trying to feel or feel
Yeah.
like that. One of my close friends mentioned this to me not so long ago that she uses that. And yeah, would you recommend
Yeah.
people?
I think I'd recommend it because the one thing I do love about the app actually is that the labels that they put on sexuality is there's heteroflexible, homoflexible, and it really kind of makes it away from these boxes, these linear like demarcated boundaries to the more fluid poetic thing I was talking about earlier, um, which I think is what people struggle with when they're becoming curious about is because you're basically shedding kind of these stories that you've been told from society that everything has to have their clear boxes and labels and opting for a bit more of a fluid spectrum approach.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, me too.
Always things when we speak. But yes, really appreciate your time. And for anyone listening, if you're interested in working with Owen, Owen is one of our practitioners. You can find him on fightingfear.co.uk. If you click on therapies and then click on meet our therapists, Owen is there and you can find out a little bit more about tips and how to work with him. Thank you again, Owen. All the best.
Yeah, take good care. Bye for now.